Afternoon. My name is Elaine Sawonka, and welcome to everyone who has managed to attend this panel. I'm very excited about this panel because it's an important topic in and of itself, but it's also it fits squarely into the Alan Turing's mission to lead the public conversation. And I'm interested in the panel also because it comes out of my own research areas, which sit at the intersection of political science and history and philosophy of ideas. The panel, I'll introduce all the panelists, and you'll be able to appreciate that they come from a cross section of disciplines and commitments. We've got AI researchers, people from the NGO world, lawyers, and people come from different parts of the globe. So let me turn to our panelists and just give you a couple of lines about them, but you can research them more in your own time. Our first, one of our panelists is Yi Zhong, and he is coming from Beijing, China, and he's the director of AI ethics and SDGs at the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence. He's also a professor within the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and he serves as the Deputy Director of Research Center for Brain-Inspired AI, Artificial Intelligence. His areas are AI ethics, governance, and brain-inspired AI. We also have Professor Firmin Debrabander, and he's a professor of political philosophy at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And he is the author of Life After Privacy, which has just come out in 2020 with Cambridge University Press, the best timed publication in the world. And you'll appreciate that because it deals with digital technologies and privacy. So he's concerned with the issues of how technology jeopardizes and can possibly sustain democracies and healthy polities. He also writes on other aspects of democracy, such as his book, Do Guns Make Us Free? I'd like to also introduce our third panelist, Diego Naranjo. He is a lawyer and he's the head of policy at the European Digital Rights NGO, which is a kind of mother organization comprised of 44 NGOs dealing with technology and rights across the EU. As a lawyer, he co-founded the Andalusia human rights organization, Grupa 17 de Marzo. And the EDRI, the NGO he's working for, has many campaigns, including one on biometric mass surveillance and privacy and data protection in various forms. One of our three AI researchers following Yi is Professor Karsten Maple, and he is a professor of cyber systems engineering at the University of Warwick. And he is situated within the Cybersecurity Center at Warwick. He's also an Alan Turing Fellow. And Karsten works on cybersecurity, issues of privacy and trust. And he's worked with police and as one of his many hats he wears, but he's worked on such issues as cyber stalking, organized crime, child safety online. He's also contributing to the project called Secure Antibody Certificates, Secure ABC, and has a lot of experience that we'll draw upon. Our final panelist is, again, another fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, Anjali Mazumdar. And Anjali is, she's the Turing lead for AI and justice and human rights. And she undertakes a variety of research around methods, AI methods and tools. But she's also working on issues around projects around human trafficking and legal evidence. And in some of that work is also affiliated with the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. And among her numerous roles, she has worked for she has been a member of Canada's National DNA Data Bank Advisory Committee from 2012 to 2018. So the structure of today's session will be that I will just try to cover as many of the questions that we've discussed as a panel before today, and I'll draw in various panel members. I'll keep an eye on the questions, but I can't promise I'll get to the questions. But I hope that most of the questions that we've identified cover the questions that show up in the chat, and I warmly welcome you to reach out to any of our panel members, staff members after. So I'd like to just start with an observation that Firmin de Brabander makes in his book, Life After Privacy. And that's that people don't seem particularly concerned about the loss of their privacy and autonomy by digital technology, paradoxically. This relates to some work done by Harvard-based author Shoshana Zuboff in her becoming very well-known book, Surveillance Capital. And Zuboff argues that it's not the information people are conscious of that they're surrendering that compromises their privacy. Rather, it's the information they relinquish with their online habits, and that they're giving away without them being aware of it. This kind of information constitute data that is the most valuable data for digital corporations and governments to extract. It constitutes what Zuboff calls the product that leads to the surveillance dividend. And what that is the surveillance dividend is the profit that companies make from selling this information, this behavioral information about users to companies, and presumably it becomes available to governments in order to make behavioral predictions on any number of things, or to give enough information about people to help people become targets for news feeds on their Facebook or suggested products, etc. So with that kind of cautioning that we've had from Zuboff's work and a number of scholars such as this, and the warning that Firmin gives us that people aren't that worried about their privacy, let me first turn to the panelists and ask them to help us better understand what is it that people aren't seeing about how their data is used. I'd appreciate a couple of our panelists just giving us some examples of how new developments in digital technology may already be, or we can expect to be used, and the way in which that might potentially compromise our privacy. So with that question in mind, I'd like to turn to Anjali to ask her if she could start our discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Elaine, for inviting me to be on this panel. So just to pick up, I think there's sort of 2 points here. One is what people don't realize is potentially being extracted or used. And then the other is this notion that people don't seem that bothered by a loss of privacy. And I think before getting to the digital side, I'm going to pick up on something more personal to us, which I think is our DNA. Can also look at fingerprints or faces, which are all biometric data. They're used for our identification, who we are, or authentication, are we who we say we are. And there's some really subtle or salient differences between these, in the sense of DNA and fingerprints require contact with a surface to be collected, whereas some of the digital footprint, including our faces, has a distance. It can be captured without that contact. But I think one of the really intrinsic things about DNA is that it's not just about us, and in fact, it's about our relatives. So people may remember, and I think this is still happening quite frequently, is that people have been excited by the opportunity to really swab their mouths and send off their genetic material to companies such as 23andMe and Ancestry to learn about variants that might reveal some sort of genetic risk or predisposition to a disease, or learn about their ancestry, like they're 13% European Spanish. And this is appealing for so many reasons. But some of these companies may also be giving this data away. So there could be beauty companies, which are personalizing skin and healthcare, but also it's can be shared and has been shared with law enforcement. And in fact, in the US, this is what happened, where law enforcement was able to search one of the databases and identify and narrow the scope to a person that it was identified as the Golden State Killer just a couple of years ago, who, yes, has been charged and accepted a guilty verdict of 13 murders and multiple rapes. And so we can view this as justice, but we do need to think about where the limits are and what type of offenses is a driving offense sufficient for a search. And we're seeing this in other ways where law enforcement is also looking to telco companies to get search warrants on where people are to help, again, narrow the search. So I think when we also get to who is not bothered by a loss of potential privacy, we really need to think about who we're speaking about and in the context. With facial recognition, and maybe Karsten can speak to this, it's also what we're talking about and then in the context. So is it for criminal justice? Is it for immigration, for humanitarian purposes? And this leaks into sort of other ways that we're leaving our digital footprint, and that's being collected and by whom. So from digital contract tracing apps, and more relevant perhaps now in terms of vaccine passports. So in what context are we allowing permissions in terms of going to school, workplaces, travel? And so I think this leads into other sort of areas of the digital divide, who's benefiting from these potential interventions, as well as the balancing the concerns around mission creep. So I think I might leave it there and ask for the other panelists and colleagues, maybe Karsten can even pick up on issues of privacy by design. Or
yeah. I think, Anjali, you mentioned something really important there, and it's something that Elaine mentioned too. Sometimes we provide our data, so you mentioned fingerprint, DNA, etc. But it's important to recognize that there are different ways for data to be shared. So it might be provided, but it might be observed, and it might be inferred or derived. So there is this framework of those four elements of ways of gaining information about someone. And sometimes it's less obvious, or contactless, as you said, or remote. So if we consider the case where it's a little bit more obvious and we understand that we're sharing some information, our challenge is that we don't always know how that information can be recombined or reused. And that's the case that you mentioned with the DNA data that can be used for a multitude of things. And sometimes these things are very good. So you mentioned about the Golden State murderer. There's also, we've seen now with people that use contact tracing apps, that data in Singapore is being shared with police. And that question that you ask, is murder okay to share it? What about if it's parking fines? You know, something that people might argue is quite trivial. But the worst thing is, you know, can it go into non-law enforcement areas where there is maybe some debt that's owed to somebody? So I think we really need to be careful and use what kind of privacy enhancing techniques we can to ensure that data is only shared with the right people at the right time.
Great, that's really helpful. And we will come back to this idea about, you know, what sorts of things we might, like privacy enhancing steps that might be taken. Before we move to another dimension of this, I just want to see Diego Naranjo. Do you want to add at this point, or do you want to come back in later?
Well, we can talk about it in detail later, but just on the last issue that Carsten was mentioning on the use of privacy-enhancing technologies or PETs, that's of course something we also recommend, but something that we can explore either now or in follow-up questions is the issue of how, in some cases, this is impossible, such as how to control your face or your movements when you are walking down the street and the use of facial recognition. And for us, this is one of the biggest battles definitely this year. And even when I have not read yet Life After Privacy, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Firmin his views, in my humble opinion, it seems that even though people do not comprehend the depth of the privacy invasions, such as described in surveillance capitalism, and they are indeed worried about the loss of their privacy. There are studies in the US and in Europe showing similar figures. The latest one saying that 80% of people in the US would prefer non-targeted advertising. But going back to facial recognition and how you cannot control that, for us it was surprising how 2 or 3 years ago, when the protests in Hong Kong were happening and there was a lot of facial recognition and activists fighting against them, that there were talks about the dictatorship and mass surveillance, this is not a democracy and so on. But in that time, we have seen how 15 states in Europe have deployed similar systems, and there was silencing all across the media. There was no critical analysis of why this was supposed to happen, on which legal basis. Even though, as we've seen, the system in London, they make mistakes in 80% of the cases when they are trying to signal suspects. And we've seen this happening in Madrid, for example, in Spain. They try to put some facial recognition system in buses, but of course they said this has nothing to do about China. This is not the same thing. It's always not the same thing if we do it, right? And that's what we call the Reclaim Your Face campaign, calling for a ban of biometrics mass surveillance, because for me, it's not even a privacy issue, really. It is a freedom of assembly. It's about trade union is protesting against Amazon, is an extinction rebellion activist in the UK, pro-abortion activist in Poland, and feminist in groups in Spain and elsewhere that could be surveilled all the time, with, of course, the excuse of national security or generally preventing criminality. But that seems to be one of the biggest threats right now.
Great. That helps, and it's useful that you cite data, which I've also heard people talk about how there is a growing concern, and and the success of your campaigns suggests that. But Firmin, can I bring you in here as well, just to comment on, to the extent to which, and certainly as having a 15-year-old, I do have a sense that there's, whole swathes, and maybe it's generation as well, that seem not bothered at all. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, Firmin, as
Sure.
well?
I'd like to point out my expertise in the matter. I have a 14, 16, 18, and 20-year-old, all digital citizens, and I teach college. I wanted to speak to what Diego said a minute ago. My view is a little bit more nuanced than that. It's not that I don't think people don't care about privacy, it's just I don't see it. I've noticed that people say it, but in their daily behavior, they don't show it. They don't show concern for it. I think, Elaine, did you want me to speak to the issue of why people are sharing? I think there's a variety of reasons. I don't know. When I started thinking about this topic very heavily, when I noticed with some alarm the kind of things that my students were sharing on Facebook when they friended me, they were not the kinds of things I certainly would share. My wife has a very good friend who likes to share her brelfies, which are breastfeeding selfies. That's a term I had to learn recently. That's not something my earlier generations would have shared. So there seems to be a new culture of sharing. People are less hung up about the kinds of things that they share. My son will tell me what I hear from my students, which is, why should I be afraid that these things are known about me, that Amazon knows my shoe size? How can that hurt me, right? So what I would say is there is certainly a lack of clarity about the value of privacy. And more importantly, as a philosopher, I would say there's a lack of clarity of what privacy is. When people tell me when my students tell me they care about privacy, then I say, well, tell me why, and tell me what is privacy, and I routinely run into stumbling blocks in that regard.
Excellent, thank you. That's really helpful, sort of brings out more of the subtlety of these issues. Let me just also bring you in, Yijing, to just comment on China is often held up as the sort of the anti-hero of these conversations, these discussions. But my sense is that in China, actually, there's a growing concern about corporations and how data is used by corporations. Have I gotten the right piece of gossip about China, or how would you characterize what people care about and what they don't care about in China?
Thank you, Alien. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I would like to extend a little bit on the impact of next generation with a story from China, but also happened elsewhere. Is really that when you have the emotion recognition in the classroom, and then to see whether for those students whether their focus is a horrible idea. I mean, for the next generation. And then actually in China, like there are many giant companies doing this. And then just like a week later, the Ministry of Education said that stop it. It's not allowed. And then you see similar things happening at Carnegie Mellon just a month later, saying that, oh, we're not only having emotion recognition, we're having gait recognition. Adding to the story, to us, it's like, oh, this is really horrible. How can people not really actually learn a lesson from the Chinese story? So that's something that I would like to talk about at first. And to me, I think I don't really see as an individual, I don't really see the reason why the companies has to be trustworthy. They're not. While in our culture we do trust the government a lot more in a way that, but there are requirements for those governments in a way that you need to keep our data safe. Otherwise, the trust is not really there. So in the pandemics, actually, in our health code system, contact tracing, that there's one day that when you input the ID of a specific person, and then actually the picture of them can show up in your cell phone. For us, it's really a disaster. So we don't know what happens right there. So, and then you learn a lesson that you trust the government at first, and then it seems that the system that the companies built for the government is not really safe. So now you know that the government is of course, to us, the culture is trustworthy. Well, they don't know too much about the current technology, and things could go wrong for them. But at least you know which way you have to bring the story to them to criticize, and then they learn a lesson from that. I think if the government learn a lesson and to behave and to change, make a change in a quick way, then it's still trustworthy. So that's what's really happening in here. I don't see for those AI giant companies in China, they have strong tie with the government. Actually, the real story is that they keep a distance with the government, so that what they did is not really being in an eye of the government. I think that's the true story here.
Okay, that's helpful clarification, actually. Let me bring in this question also of trade-offs with digital technology, because these discussions tend to be quite polemic, that, oh, it's great, or, oh, it's we're all going to be subject to authoritarianism. And Karsten, you and I spoke a little bit before the panel a few days ago about trade-offs, and Diego, you and I have spoke about red lines that that EDRI talk about. So can I invite the two of you to come in, Karsten, maybe to talk, give the positive case for trade-offs, although I'm sure you have many negatives, and if you want to do both, that's fine. And Diego, if you could just also talk about why EDRI feels that actually conceptualizing this in terms of red lines is important, because it, for whatever reason, but I suspect it's so that we don't have to have the discussion of every new technology. We can have some general principles, but let me turn that over. Karsten, do you want to start? Everybody's mesmerized, Yijing, by your lovely daughter. She's so, she's so stealer. Okay, Karsten?
Yeah, so Yijing mentioned Trustworthy a few times there, and we have at the Turing a large project on trustworthy digital identity. And we define trustworthy to have a number of components. So something that's trustworthy should be able to show that it's secure. And that was also what you mentioned too. It's privacy preserving, it's ethical, robust, reliable, and resilient. And the important thing is, when you consider that this trustworthy kind of notion, there are trade-offs. If we want something to be really secure, then we have to understand about privacy that might require some relaxation. Because, for example, if we want to learn whether a system has been compromised to detect so-called anomalies, then what we might want to do is see how individuals are interacting with that system. And that means they can't be truly anonymous, or they can be pseudonymized, but not anonymous in the sense that some of the interactions can be linked. Equally, if we have a system that's very transparent, that could compromise the overall effectiveness of the system. We wouldn't want, for example, anti-money laundering to be completely transparent, because those who seek to abuse the system can then overcome being noticed by the anti-money laundering algorithms. So I think we have to accept that when we're engineering solutions, and that's what I do, that there are trade-offs, and we have to think about the specific case in point, the efficacy of the solution, and that was really important what Diego mentioned about live facial recognition. The efficacy of the solution was not clear. A good judgment was not made by South Wales Police, for example, about how effective the system was. So how can you then do the balance against the harms to, in that case, Ed Bridges? So I think we have to understand these trade-offs will take place.
Diego, do you want to come in there? Thank you.
Yes, in the case of artificial intelligence, what we see is, in some cases, as put in the case of facial recognition, there is really no trade-off to do, and in some cases, in our opinion, there should be some clear red lines for this type of AI technologies. The other day, Commissioner Reinders, which is in a way at the EU Ministry for Fundamental Rights, was in a way balancing, or trying to balance innovation, so-called innovation versus fundamental rights. I guess this is not a new argument for everyone, but of course, what we say that you can have innovation, you can have a new technology without undermining people's human rights. And in this case, in the case of AI technology, we are not even asking for a ban on the technology itself, but of a specific deployments of AI-based technology. So specifically, so we are asking first for a ban on some specific system that, for their very nature, will be used to infringe fundamental rights or collective rights, such as facial recognition. Then we are asking to incorporate mandatory, publicly accessible, and human rights impact assessment for all users of AI, to be sure that they protect fundamental rights. And then, when needed, complement this effort with stronger enforcement, of course, of data protection and privacy laws. And regarding the ban, I was mentioning the specific use of biometrics, mass surveillance and monitoring of public spaces. But there are others. In the EU was a project where deploying a so-called lie detectors, AI-based lie detectors that would scan the faces of refugees or people who are claiming asylum, and will, with this magic algorithm, theoretically, see if they are lying or not about the right to claim asylum in Europe. That we see as a very pervasive, invasive technology. Then we have social scoring. We have algorithms in Poland being deployed that you would get a response or not from this black box, giving you access to social services and to the welfare state. We have predictive policing in the UK, and many things like this that we believe need to be either expelled totally, so not deployed in our societies, or if in some cases with very strong limitations and safeguards, so we are sure that the technology does what it's supposed to do, but not exclude people and discriminate others.
Thank you. Angeli, could I bring you in there, because this sort of starts to get into territory that you've got an expertise in, and so maybe to comment on what Diego said, and if not that, then could you also just sort of address this kind of slippery slope idea as well? You know, that we know in terms of following 9/11, the Homeland Security Act in the US allowed for expanded use of biometric data, but that didn't go away. And can you speak a little bit to that concern?
Sure. I might pick up one other thing in terms of facial recognition and human rights, is that, you know, a lot of what we've been talking about is the privacy side of things, but there's also other human rights, such as anti-discrimination. And, you know, facial recognition has also thrown up that, as many other areas of technology, digital technology, that is potentially having differential outcomes in terms of for people. So I think we should also remember that and consider that as part of that area. And of course, this is an area of research. There are many of us working on algorithmic fairness, and again, that also brings up a host of questions of what fairness is and several fairness metrics. And then I guess, yes, so to the other point is, yes, post 9/11, we saw a change in terms of an increase in the use of biometrics and in sharing biometric data, how data was being collected in terms of land, sea, air. In the US, you know, it was fingerprints, faces that's being collected on a regular basis. And that hasn't left, right? So the concern or the risk remained. And what we're seeing in terms of the public health emergency right now with COVID-19 is also legislation has changed. It allowed a relaxation on some of the data protection laws, allowing for governments and other agencies working with governments to collect data. This is including for, you know, not just digital contact tracing apps or the vaccine passports, but across a range in terms of medical diagnostics, all the way to community groups that are collecting data to try and support their communities. The question becomes is that there's not only just issues about the data collection, retention, consent, but how long these technologies stay. You know, does it stay past the point of when the crisis so-called ends, and how long afterwards? And those bring into these issues of necessity, proportionality. But the, you know, again, I sort of raised, if we're talking about facial recognition or in other areas, what is the context? And what are those responsible limits that we set? And I don't think that those are well determined or defined, and so it's an ongoing basis, but it is something that we need to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Just want to see, does anybody else from the panel want to come in at this point on this?
I will just say, if I may, Elaine, that interestingly, that point that Anjali mentioned, due to the Tokyo Games and the threat of cyber attack, the Japanese government has passed a law that it can hack into the consumer IoT, Internet of Things devices of its citizens. And this kind of thing is around a specific issue. The Tokyo Games are protecting that. It's a big stage to do, but will they really ensure that then what's the next major event that they might say, well, this is quite important. It's a big football match or something like that. And we're going to take and exercise that right to actually hack into they will try weak passwords on IoT devices to get into them. So that then they can perhaps take them offline so that they're not involved in what we call a distributed denial of service attack. So there are technologies like that, which are pretty serious, I think.
I'm going to come back in a minute to this question of what are the challenges to effective regulation and sort of countering some of these pernicious phenomenon. But before we do, Furman, can I just bring you in here to we've been talking in terms of people's individual rights, their privacy. Anjali sort of expanded it that groups, there's also sort of risks for entire groups, and a number of us, can come up with quite a few examples of that. But and people, especially in this kind of COVID era, a lot of people say, I don't mind, there's a pandemic out there, whatever it takes. But how can you take us beyond the individual sort of calculation that they're doing that might reflect on why is it bad for all of us, for a healthy political system, be it democratic or any other kind of healthy polity?
Sure. Well, my colleague in Beijing mentions trust, and I think that's a major issue. Speaking in non-technical terms, why should I trust a government that has my data, even if they're keeping it securely? Why should I trust a major tech firm? I'm thinking of Google's motto, don't be evil. Why does a firm need that motto? That suggests I maybe should be worried about what they're doing. So this idea that I should inherently trust anybody who has my data, that is problematic. The political danger, of course, is what could they possibly do with this? Speaking to what I was talking about earlier, I think most people, this is, at least American consumers, this is hard for them to perceive. The age of totalitarian regimes that we are familiar with in this country is a long time ago. We didn't have it on this soil exactly. So people don't really fear that they're sharing this data with companies. I don't know why there isn't more healthy mistrust of companies in America. Companies don't have a great track record of being trustworthy with a lot of things. But I think in the name of convenience and the speed of the digital economy, people are just willing to sacrifice. Politically speaking, the curious phenomenon about this whole thing is this. Foucault, the French philosopher Michel Foucault, articulated one of the most remarkable critiques of surveillance, of its political effect, and pointing out that when we're watched, and we know we're watched, and we don't know why, this could lead to a kind of coercion and a kind of chilling effect on speech. And the funny thing is, online, I don't see that. I see people babbling away, bending over backwards to share their stuff. So it's very strange. Things did not turn out the way that Foucault and other philosophers predicted it would be. I've grappled to figure out why. I think there's something about the digital medium itself that maybe there's kind of some semblance of privacy that makes people feel they are anonymous and they can share whatever they want. But I would like to also tap into an argument that Zeynep Tufekci has made. She's an American scholar. She points out that, this digital age, this semblance of privacy, this suits, where this is not real privacy, but it's a semblance of privacy. This suits autocratic regimes, their best dream, because, the citizens babble away, and the autocratic regime can keep an eye on them and hear everything that's going on. So there's really not, interestingly enough, there's not so much a desire for censorship or stilling of speech, there is a desire to hear what people have to say. And this medium is absolutely great for people to be more than frank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of a thin line between being responsive to the public and letting them just babble away and making policies and decisions with that knowledge, but not necessarily in a response to give people what they want. That's right. Interesting. Thank you. I'm going to, because time is ticking on, I'm going to fuse my last two questions. One, as I indicated about, what are the challenges to regulating digital technology, be it corporations' use of it or the government's use of it? And let me fuse that with the question of, if we could horizon scan for a minute toward any activities that you might be able to indicate that are sort of going on toward better regulation, which might be about campaigns. And Diego, you've given us a taster for some of those, but if there's any others that you think are sort of particularly successful, that would be great. Or in the case of researchers, are there things researchers could be doing or are doing? So two things. What are the challenges in regulating this better? And what are some of the things that are going on that might have legs, or if you want to, flag why they're not having legs, to kill a metaphor? Okay, I'll turn that over. Who would like to take a stab at that, actually? Furman, would you? Yeah, you're muted.
I'd like to start, and only because I only know about the problems and I don't know about the solutions. So I'm going to let my colleagues who know
social scientists. Okay.
I'm excellent about problems. The problems, I think, are centered around this idea that, in general, as far as I've heard, the privacy regulations that are proposed in the States, and which model on what's going on in Europe, is that they want to prioritize the individual's control over his or her private data. And I think that's an immensely troubled proposition for a couple of reasons. For one thing, as I've been talking about, I'm not sure about the appetite for that. How do you put this kind of responsibility on people when the culture of being responsible for your data is out the window? If that culture changes, then I might sing a different tune, but I don't see that. The other issue relates to what people are talking about earlier, is that how are we supposed to have control over our data, or say which data the companies can take, when we have no idea how they collect it, what they're collecting, and what they're going to do with it? This is a very sophisticated science. Shoshana Zuboff uses the word, she calls the data analysts the high priests, and what means that they're working in some kind of arcane science that I don't believe we have any idea what they're doing with it. I was reading recently about how they're interested in how we hold our cell phone and how we manipulate our finger on the screen. People don't know that they're doing this. And I mean, I didn't, and I wrote a book on privacy, so I assume they don't know it. And we have no idea what they're learning from that, right? That seems perfectly harmless to me, but I don't know what end that's going to. When I give examples to my students about the kinds of things, the kinds of ends that these companies are learning from our data, like the fact that a Canadian retailer, determines creditworthiness on the basis of if I purchase felt pads to protect my furniture. Who knows? Who can understand that kind of logic? I think this is very far beyond us. So now I'm very eager to hear the solutions.
If I can come up, I hope I can bring some solution. We try to be constructive as civil society. We have to be in Europe. So one, regarding privacy and data protection, one of the things we need to improve, especially in Europe, is enforcement. We have the jewel of the crown in data protection in Europe is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But as anyone that looks a bit closely, the enforcement has been quite bad, if not poor, at least. The main big tech companies have not been severely affected. Amazon does whatever they want with the data, and they have faced zero complaints, to my knowledge, and zero fines. And for me, the risk of all of this is creating a sort of time travel machine. This vast amount of data that Freeman and others today have been commenting, this is going to be feeding into a mass amount of data that will help the authoritarian governments or any sort of government that wants to crack on dissent to go back and try to find who was where, meeting whom, talking about what in each time of the history. And why this is happening, why there's no strong enforcement. There are many causes, but one of them is that the connections of the industry and government, what is called the security industrial complex. Now, we've seen one concrete example in Europe where there was some legislation that was finally adopted to have what we call air passenger surveillance, so the collection of passenger name records, everyone flying in and out of the EU. And we found out there was a connection, at least some loose connection between the former French president and the company, the French company deploying the technology. So sometimes there's feedback, there's some internal connection between those that are problematic.
Great, thank you. Yijing, could I bring you in here too? Because I know that you've spoken in the before about the sort of gap between the principles and policymakers' sort of ideals and how current AI technology can ground and implement those principles. You know, do we have the technical challenges that make the laws and principles, are they too ideal to be implemented properly?
Thank you for the question. Actually, I just ran from another conference at Singapore that Singapore organized about trustworthy AI. And now I would like to claim it here that actually the current technology doesn't really enable us to have the safer digital human rights, I would say. Taking one of the examples is really data erasure in many versions of the policy, let's say in GDPR and many of the Chinese regulation, that people prefer that I have the right to delete my data, and then the law protected this kind of requirement. But what actually happens is really that it is quite easy to delete the user data or your private data from the database. But now we don't really have any technical solution to delete your data from the AI models. So once you want to make a requirement saying, I want my data back, and then what actually happening is that for those giant companies, they delete your data in the database, but they never delete your data in the AI models that they trained. For those giant models that they train, they actually retrain the model like 2 weeks at a time, or even a month at a time, or even longer. So in this case, your data are never been deleted. So it's already there for those features, your private features is already there. So it's very beautiful, and it's really necessary that we have something like data erasure. But when those giant companies saying that, oh, we are 100 totally compliant with GDPR, I said, no one can do that for now, because the current technology does not enable us to do so. So you cannot erase single user's data from an AI model. So the current AI technical researchers like me is not trustworthy. So we have to face the reality, saying that there are a lot more that the technical efforts has to make to really ground those very beautiful, very I would say required principles for safer society. That there's a lot that has to be done.
Thank you. That's sobering. Karsten, can I bring you in here as well as another researcher to comment on what's been said so far?
Yeah, I think that the point that Yi made, and you touched on it because we've spoken about it before, there is this sort of disconnect in a way between people who create regulation and people who work in technology, and each have got their own driving agendas. But what we've got to understand, really, to address this, it's a socio-technical challenge. And as such, we need collaboration between the technologists, because you very eloquently just said there about erasing somebody's name from a database is one thing, but from a model, there's a business consideration. There's also difficulties in how long ago has that model been going? Is it actually feasible to try and delete some data, because you've got a right to delete your data from a long time ago, right? So another area I would also say is, and I see this bandied about a lot, about data minimization, and that's really important. And if we look at privacy impact assessments and we look at regulation, it says, oh, you should only have data that you really need. Well, I've started to speak to people from New Zealand who are doing the digital identity standards. They're for trusted and trustworthy digital identity. And I say, well, actually, you can take data and use it, but does it actually give you any benefit? And that's where I talk about that trade-off, you see. If you take a lot more data from a set of people, and two solutions, one is very data intrusive, let's say, and one is less intrusive, significantly less, but the outcomes are very similar, then you can argue in both cases you've been data minimal because you've used the minimum data for your algorithm. But you could have got similar results being much more respectful around the privacy. And that's where technology can say, okay, I recognize this problem. Let us see if we can give some metrics to try and help that, how we can measure that. How can we solve some of the key desires in those creating regulation through technological means? So I really think, and I'm proud to work at the Turing Institute, where we can bring together, we can convene and coordinate experts from different areas to try and solve these grand challenges.
Great. Yeah, I like that image of the collaboration between technologists and policymakers and political philosophers. Anjali, let me bring you in as having the final word on this.
Wow, that's a little heavy final word. I think maybe picking up on Karsten and sort of rather than a solution, a sort of pathway or one of these approaches in terms of a socio-technical solution or approach is one of our projects at the Turing is a participatory approach. So a participatory AI to tackling sexual exploitation online. And this has been one of my interests, which is to really bring together multidisciplinary and multi-sector partnerships as a pathway towards the trustworthy and responsible AI. I think one thing we need to remember too is that there is the companies that might be developing these tools. There's also researchers developing methods, which are then implemented in commercial tools. There's the data that's being collected on other commercial platforms. And so we're bringing together all these different stakeholders. So the platform in which data is being put on there, the technology company that is scraping that data, that's using that data to build a tool. We are bringing together the law enforcement and in the UK, our Home Office and National Crime Agency that look at the national level sort of questions and issues, to the NGO side in terms of those individuals that are most affected by this. So that's including our Modern Slavery Helpline, which has managed to put the helpline on one of these adult service websites and are gathering information, to the Internet Watch Foundation, to also engaging with the those that are most affected, so the survivors, and those that are, in this case, also, we're talking about the adult side in our case, so it's sex workers, to really understand actually the data that they're putting on there, or in the case of victims where they're being coerced in some way. So indirectly, it's not their choice to put the data on potentially, but they're being exposed. So we're really trying to bring that all together, and we're recognizing that human rights laws were not developed by technologists, computer scientists. So we're bringing together law, ethics, anthropologists, domain experts, and then us, yes, as the data science and AI community, to really draw out what are those issues, how can we really think about it in terms, and then respond with respect to some of the AI principles that have been put out in terms of transparency, robustness, reliability, fairness, to really try and address that. And I think just to go back to sort of one of Karsten's points is also recognizing that in some of these instances too, with respect to transparency, in the case of sexual exploitation online, we don't necessarily want the perpetrators to actually know the algorithms and how they're being used, but we're needing to find this right balance. So how do we engage those that are most affected by it, who could be most marginalized, and trying to find again these balances. So it's an approach which is, in the early days takes a lot of work to try and think about how we bring that together and the sustainability of these tools, right? As researchers, we're sitting somewhat on our own here. We're not going to be monitoring the tool, so we need to figure out how the entire ecosystem and how that works. So
it's very nice to end with an example, a model of how this kind of cross-sector multidisciplinary approach might produce more ethical research. I guess I think we need to have another panel on how do we generalize from that? How do we make that more than just individual research projects that get it right? And what's the relationship they might have with campaigns? But this has been a very rich discussion of both of the challenges of the fundamental problems, and I'm pleased that we've also managed to pull in some of the solutions that are just at the beginning stage, but we see green shoots as well. I'd just want to flag that this panel, it will be on YouTube. If anybody wants to watch it again or share it, please do. I think it's been a lot of important points made. And I'd like to conclude by thanking each of the panelists very much for your time, for your expertise, for your commitment to these issues, and for improving what technology, the benefits mean for people without so much of the costs as maybe people feel like right now they're bearing. So I'm sorry that we're not all in a room that you can hear applause, because I think that there's a lot of people listening that very much appreciate it. But me as a emblematic of that, thank you very, very much. And please, anybody who's listening, please continue to watch out for the Turing, because certainly Anjali's got lots of work that's happening in her role as theme lead for human rights and justice. And I hope that wearing my international hat, I also explore some of these topics further. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and till we meet again. Bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.